Welcome, friends, to this episode of the Sync Your Life podcast. Today, I have my friend Aandra Bohlen with me. She and I met over a year ago through business experiences, and we've come back full circle for this podcast interview. We actually had some common ground in talking about adoption and our own adoption stories, being adopted children this was like, I think 2021 when we had that conversation. And I remember telling her at some point, I'm going to feature people like you on my podcast. I want to hear more stories and I want my people to hear more stories about adoption. And so I sent her an email and said, hey, would you be willing to come on the show and share your story? And she said yes. So that's what brings us here today. I'm excited. I don't even really know the ins and outs of her story. So I'm going to be learning along with you today, asking some questions and bringing to light her personal journey with adoption. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. I'm just going to have you, Aandra, share like a little bit about yourself, who you are day to day, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. Thanks so much. And I'm so excited that we came back around to one another. I always enjoyed our conversation. Okay, so this is really interesting. So this is actually a unique podcast interview because typically I'm doing interviews around sales coaching and sales mindset and things of that nature. So that's what I do as far as like my work is I'm a sales consultant. I work directly with entrepreneurs and small businesses to help them essentially make more sales and do it easily. And there's a lot of emotion that's wrapped up around selling. So I really like diving deep with people in their relationship with selling so that they can do it more comfortably and confidently. I also have a heart for people who are underprivileged. You know, I'm really a human potential activist. I just recently went through a rigorous interview process to become a CASA, which is basically a court-appointed special advocate for children. So I start that training in this upcoming week and really excited to dive into that. So that's who I am. I'm a daughter of in a family that has I have three adopted siblings between myself and my sister and my brother, and then they have one biological son. And we used to be known as kind of like the United Benetton of colors because my parents are from a super duper small town in Moequa, Illinois. There's not even, I think there's a stoplight now. And they have always been human potential activists as well, always looking for ways to help people. And one of the ways was to create home for children who wouldn't have one otherwise. And that's kind of how their adoption journey began and how I came into the fold. We can go deeper into that, but I just wanted to kick it off with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's so we originally met because of your amazing sales coaching and all that kind of stuff. And so I know you're a powerhouse in what you do. And it was interesting because I remember after we talked, I remember feeling like this sense of like, well, how long am I gonna have to wait to now hear more about her story? Like, I remember you like kind of like told me a few things about, you said something like, oh, I'd love to talk to you more about adoption. Then we sort of ended the conversation. So we're gonna pick that up where we left off. So I'd love to just start off, just for anyone listening, tell us about that. Like, tell us about your parents' journey. Like, what did that look like, and how did they go about pursuing you and your siblings?
Yeah. So my parents, like I said, they had their own biological son. And my mom was a director at a daycare center and was really involved in social justice issues and had connected with a really popular family who were advocates for foster care and adoption. And that's kind of how their link began. And so the first person that they adopted was my brother Thor. And one thing that they were really clear about is they wanted to adopt children that would be hard to adopt. In other words, whether they were too old or they had a defect or something. So my brother Thor came from Vietnam and he was 5 when he was adopted, and he came out of like the Vietnam War. So he came malnutritioned, not well, right? Like lice and just not cared for. That was the first one. And then my sister was adopted. So he wasn't adoptable. And I'm putting that in air quotes because in many cases at that time, people wanted to adopt, little cute white with pink, little cute, little rosy cheek babies, And so he was adopted. My sister was adopted. Now she was adopted at 6 months old. She was adopted from already in foster care, and they thought she was deaf. And she wasn't deaf. She just wasn't responsive to the people that she was with. So then I came, and how I came was really interesting because at that point they had experience with adoption, obviously, but my situation was really unique because there was a child in a baby in my mom's daycare that she wanted to adopt who was essentially dying, had a disease, but it was still at the daycare center, and not a contagious disease, by the way, but was sick. And my parents wanted to adopt them, and they weren't allowed to. There was some state laws. It's like early 70s. But that same friend, the DeBolt, said, "Hey, have you ever thought about adopting in Africa?" At that time, they were getting ready to close, and still to this day, you cannot adopt a child in North Africa, because they don't want the culture washed away. I don't know the right word of it, but essentially they want to maintain the integrity of the Muslim culture that exists there. And so anyone who is not of that culture cannot adopt. So that's when they got the alert, like, hey, they're getting ready to shut down adoption in North Africa. So I was born in Tunisia. Have you thought about adoption? And they were like, okay. And it went very differently than adoptions go today. It was, you hire a lawyer, you file the paperwork, you get your visa, and you go fly and pick up the kid.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in their situation, they had to, the one condition that they had to meet, because I really was one of the last, there's like 13 of us kids that were the last ones adopted from Tunisia before the law changed. They had to convert to Muslim. So that they had to convert to Muslim in front of a judge to qualify to adopt me.
Wow.
And I saw in my baby book, I have their Muslim, like almost like a passporty birth certificate type thing. But they had to convert. Their journey to adopting me was one of joy and loss, because while they were there, they had to, you have a host family, and they weren't at that host family, but you had to have like a contact there.
Mm-hmm.
And they went to their host family one day, and they got a call that my grandfather had died. And so my mom was in this situation of, we haven't completed the adoption process. Do I need to come home? And they're like, if you go home, you can't come back.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a very difficult time for my mom, because at that time I think she was in her mid-20s. By the time she had 4 kids, she was mid to latter 20s, if you can imagine that.
Wow. Wow.
I know. I'm thinking, when in my mid-20s, I was, didn't even think about kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
We were in our
So,
30s when we did. So yeah,
yeah. So they were
so
getting
true.
busy. Like it was, they were fully on board. Yeah. So I was brought back into this family of people,
Mm-hmm.
and my journey began from there, really. The orphanage, I have pictures of me at the orphanage, and the caretakers, one of the caretakers is crying. They gave me a name, Ibtisam, which means happy and smile. And when my mom was just sharing this with me the other day, and she said, do you remember, um, why you have that name? And I'm like, well, I just assumed, I know that it came from the caretaker at the orphanage, because I was dropped off at the orphanage essentially as like a baby, a Jane Doe, as we would know it in the United States. Likely my birth mother had birthed me in like a village of sorts. And then I know that I wasn't taken from day one to the orphanage, which is why I don't really have a birthday.
Yeah.
I have lots of birth certificates that say different things, but I have a birthday because we've claimed one. And we claimed the one that was closest to my mom's dad, my grandfather, who passed away while they were there. But yeah, Ibtisam is my birth name, which means happy and smile. And she reminded me that a judge, when they said, what is her legal name? And my mom said, Aandra von Bohlen. And the judge said, don't you mean Aandra Ibtisam von Bohlen? And she said, I'll never forget, that was one of the greatest gifts from that judge, because he knew that maintaining a piece of my culture, even just in name, would be really important to me. To this day, it is. I feel really connected. I feel connected to my name as a whole, but Ibtisam means
Yeah.
something very deeply to me.
That's so cool. That's so
Mhm.
cool. I love that. Well, I want to kind of just dive straight in. This is something that's very near and dear to my heart, which is transracial adoption, right? Like both of my girls are different race than me and my husband. So we get questions, right? We get looks when we go to the pool, all that kind of stuff. So I'm sure that growing up in this sort of mixed family, this United Colors experience, like I'm sure you experienced all that. So I'd love to hear, when it came to your culture and what you were birthed into as opposed to what you were growing up into, how did your parents navigate that with you, and what was it like to be part of a transracial family
It was
as a
hard.
child?
It was really hard. I'm not going to lie to you. Now, what I will say that's different is I'm talking to you and I'm recalling back to the mid 70s, early 80s. Now, first of all, as you're coming into your teen years, you're already as a human dealing with identity, right? You're trying to find yourself. And for me, growing up where I couldn't see myself in anybody. Now, what my parents did was one thing that they did that I am so grateful for is they curated my baby book has everything that you could imagine, from Tunis. Like I have, I don't even know how I should ask them how they managed to do this, but like I have a bird cage from Tunis. I have wooden camels. I have placemats. I have pictures. I have maps. I have every letter that every exchange that went back on that paper thin, see through almost like tissue paper writing.
Mm-hmm,
Every
mm-hmm.
letter of exchange that went back and forth between my parents, they saved that for me to the point where my mom and I were just talking. We're very close. We were talking the other day and we were doing this exercise of what can you let go of? And I was like, they can have everything, but they can't have my baby book or my passport because one, my passport proves that I belong here. And two, my baby book is all I have. So they can't
Mm-hmm.
have that. They can have everything else. They can have it all. So that kind of gives you, hopefully that helps the listeners realize like that's very
Important.
precious to me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Gosh, what were you saying? Because I was starting to get emotional. What were you saying?
No, that's okay. I
Oh,
mean,
growing up. So they
yeah,
did,
just growing up with them.
yeah.
Mhm.
So they did everything that they could as far as like, um, making me doing their best to teach me about Black culture, African culture. I know that they did that as we were younger, especially they made all of us really like why we're special, why we're important. And quite frankly, my parents got kicked out of certain parts of their family for having children of color. They took the heat, but that's what they wanted to do. My mom is very mission driven about people and social justice and things of that and inclusion. So she's always been like that. I think if my mom were here, she'd admittedly say, like, I think that there's more that we could have done. I think every parent says that, whether they're adopted or not. But specifically, I think that they were out of their depth in the reality of like just how different is this, and things have changed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now I walk out and I see so many different beautiful shades of brown, and I can't, um, there's so many different nationalities and things of that nature. It just wasn't like that for me growing up. So I really did struggle. I'm not going to lie. In spite of their best efforts, it was hard.
Mm-hmm.
I felt disconnected. I didn't, and then as we moved into like high school, I really didn't have Black friends, or I didn't really fit into anything until I really just realized that, you know, I, that the connection opportunity was deeper, it had to become deeper than me
Yeah.
looking for faces of connection,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I get it. Especially, I have a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old, and
Mhm.
both are African American, biracial, African American Caucasian mix, and we talk frequently about skin color, and we try to do as many like books on the topic as we can, just to kind of make it something that we talk about, make it something that's an open thing. A couple of things that came to my mind. One is, I do want to touch on this because this is a question that I get often. And it's one of those where when I have private conversations with people who are interested in adoption and they have questions, it's like they're afraid to ask it, but at the same time, they're like, okay, I'm going to ask this. And I'm not, I'm just, there's no necessarily opinion here, but I'm just going to ask you. Right. And usually the question is surrounding like the transracial piece.
Mhm.
And I wish it was in conversation more, but I will tell you that when my oldest was coming, and that's a story in itself. But when my oldest was on her way and we knew that we were connected with the birth mother, ours was a domestic adoption both times. We knew that there was a chance that she could be of a different race. We didn't necessarily know. And so, of course, we notified our parents. They were the only ones who knew that we were adopting at that time. And of course they were like, whatever, we don't care. We'll love anyone.
Yeah.
And then when she came and we knew right away with these black curls popping, we're like, okay, like now we know. It was like taking on a new journey, like even for myself, right? Like it was just such a transformational thing, and it has given me such perspective that I didn't have before. But back to what I was saying, like couples that ask the question about that, right? Like, because here's the thing, especially with domestic adoptions, it sounds crazy, but it's true. When you work with an agency or an attorney and you decide to pursue the adoption process, it's different by state, of course. But when you do that, most of the time there is paperwork involved where you have to specify what you're open to. You have to specify, like, are you open to a child of another race? Are you open to a child of disability? And let me tell you, as a person who has had to fill out that paperwork, it is challenging. It's hard because sometimes it has nothing to do with the way you feel about another race. And it has everything to do with, am I capable? Am I capable of raising this child in a culture that might be different from my own? And so I wanted to bring that up just because I do think a lot of people ask the question of like, well, I'm not necessarily opposed to a child of another race, but is this something that's for me?
Yeah.
I can tell you, being where I am now, like, and this isn't my interview, but being where I am now with my oldest, especially, I can tell you again that it has changed my life and it has changed my perspective so much.
Yeah.
And so, of course, I'm like number one fan, right? I'm like, yes, you can do it. Yes, you can absolutely do it. But it takes intentionality. It takes your own personal growth in this area. And it's not something that's easy. I think you've done a good job of saying like it was hard, and it's okay to say that.
I think so too. And what I really respect is for anyone that has that question and is uncomfortable with that and kind of poses that question of like, am I capable of? I have a lot of respect for that because that tells me that they most likely do because they're asking the question in itself, right? Because there is a responsibility, and my parents did do a great job as far as like the responsibility of doing their best to expose us to that culture. Now they couldn't take me back to Tunisia every month or, once a year.
Right.
They weren't financially in a position to do that, nor could they do that for my brother who was adopted from Vietnam. But they did their best and the best that they could do with the tools that they have. And I say, and the one thing I wouldn't want to do is dissuade someone from thinking that here I am, this, North African girl saying that, that I have any regrets being in a family that I did, because quite frankly, there was a lot of advantages being in multicultural. I was as an adult, career wise, I've been able to move in a lot of different ways that I think allowed me to, what's the word? I don't know, because I was around so many different cultures. I could move with them. I didn't feel, and this is part of my learning now, is that there's some naivety on my part because I've kind of lived this different lifestyle, like how I move in corporate and things like that. I didn't experience, at least I didn't think that I experienced racism. I wasn't paying attention, to be quite frank. And I was very comfortable with white people. And I really actually was most uncomfortable with Black people. And that's because I know I couldn't see myself in them. And that's a whole nother conversation of what happens in certain communities. The lighter you are, there's other things that happen there. But I would say that I think that, the reality is, and tell me if this isn't the case today, from what I know is that the reality is most kids that are up for adoption are going to be of different ethnicities. And so the opportunity is that everybody deserves an opportunity to be a part of a loving family. And so if someone's willing to be responsible, and I think that's the key. If someone were to be ask me your opinion, Aandra, should I adopt a person of color? I'd say if you're willing to immerse yourself in that culture, absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. And that's exactly what I wrote down to say next, which is the best advice we ever got was before we knew what race she was going to be, we had to, in the US, you have to go through a home study process. So you have to
Mhm.
be, it's interesting. Sometimes I think about it and I think, my husband and I had to be fingerprinted. We had to have urine tests. We had to have all these things, but yet anybody can walk into the hospital and have a baby and walk out with it, so it's interesting. But I think about that sometimes and I'm like, okay. But with her, because there was that potential, we had you have to do so many hours of education with this home study. And so part of those hours had to be on the topic of transracial adoption. And we were working with a social worker at the time who I love dearly, and just older woman who was like beyond retirement, but just loved what she did. So she continued to do this. And I'll never forget the advice she gave us. And I share it often with people who have transracial families. And that is, she said, are you willing to put yourself in the room where you are the minority? And to me, that was like the perfect response and the perfect question. And I ask myself that question so often. Like at that time, we were going to a church that was 95% white. We were living in a community that was 80% white, right? Like my salon is all white hairdressers, right? Like everything that we were doing. And you don't realize it until you have a child holding your hand and you walk them into that church or you walk them into that hair salon and you start to realize, wait a minute, like they are the minority here. And how can I make myself uncomfortable and do something,
Yeah.
and we've gone, my oldest and I have gone to a Black salon, right? It's not my most comfortable moment, but it's something that I need to do. And if you're willing to do that sort of thing, right, there is a need. And I'm glad you brought that up too. We were told that unfortunately, even though you mentioned, I think back in the 70s, everybody wanted a white rosy cheek baby. Unfortunately, I think that's oftentimes still the case because I know when we were looking at the statistics for everything, especially with my second one, as we were going through like the formal process, we were told the same thing, that there was such a higher need for, minority adoption. And so to me, like again, love makes a family has nothing to do with skin color. And I'm so blessed that we're in the position that we're in. If you would have asked me like 20 years ago, I'd have been like, well, okay, like maybe, but now I'm like, it's such a life-changing thing.
True.
So yeah.
And I would also say that beyond love making a family, it's truth, honesty. Because when someone is adopted, and this is the thing that I was telling you before we hit record, that I noticed when I had that community that was not present, is this idyllic savior complex from those who were adopting. And my parents always kept it real with, first of all, they told us about being adopted before we could conceptualize what that even meant, right? But they understand, and they told me this, we know that your life began with loss, not trauma, loss.
Yeah.
You no longer have your birth mother. And we can't even imagine, like the sensitivity, the truth, the transparency, because I have a friend who was actually adopted and didn't find out until she was going through boxes trying to find something and found the newspaper article.
Oh, wow.
So there is, so to me, love isn't enough. When it comes to like building a family in this way, it has to come with courage. It has to come with the sacrifice, like what you're making of like, I have to be willing. I have to make sure that I'm giving my child access to their culture equally to what I'm giving of my own. And then you have to be truthful, and you have to understand that like there's, to this day, I mean, certainly I'm proud of who I am as a person, but I would be lying to you if I said that I know that there is a part of me that I don't know if it's a hole that can be repaired. And yet still I love my parents. I love, I'm so happy. I'm happy that I'm here. I'm happy that I know them, and I'm happy that I get to call them parents, but I know that there's a piece of me, and for any adopted person who's been adopted, for many people, and the way it was described to me by my therapist was like there's this like metaphoric, like invisible umbilical cord.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't get cut. There's something. And so for me, a lot of the sadness that I experience now is wishing that I could let her know, if she's still alive, that I'm okay. Because I can't even imagine. Now, hearing from birth mothers and that pain that they have of wanting to seek and find out what happened to their birth children and not having access to answers, that's always my greatest wish. So I think it's important in the adoption community is that we all recognize that there's so many pieces to this. It's not linear. It's not one way.
Yeah.
There's a triad, and that all has to be cared for, no matter where you're at in that process.
Yeah. That's a really powerful thing to say. I mean, the truth piece is so true. And, I know we were talking a little offline before this, and we were talking about seeing this from different angles, right? Because there is sort of the adoptive couple angle. There is the, and I just heard this mentioned recently, and you alluded to it too, this sort of heroic, right? Like the gotcha day, and I've saved you mentality, right? And then there's the adopted child's perspective, which is oftentimes, for lack of better terms, a bit lost, right? Like I mean, I was speaking with a trauma-informed therapist on this topic, and she was talking about how, like, of course, all adoption comes from loss, and there's trauma there, whether it's, people could argue and say like, well, a baby can't experience trauma. Sure, a baby can experience trauma. I mean, we've seen that happen with my children as well. And so at some point, right, there becomes questioning, or there becomes this sort of lost sense, right? So there's the child's perspective, but then there's also the birth mother's perspective. And I'll be honest, like, as an adopted child myself, there wasn't a lot of pieces to my story that I knew. There was literally like, it was like a 2 or 3 sentence story, right? Like, your birth mother walked into her OBGYN's office 8 months pregnant and said, I want to give this child up for adoption. What do I do? That's the story I knew, and nothing more, nothing less. And it was the 80s, it was the early 80s. And so there wasn't like a formal process. Like, my parents didn't meet her. There was, the OBGYN was actually responsible for keeping me in the hospital with a fake ailment so that I would not be taken in by the nuns and the Catholic system. And then he sort of arranged my parents, who worked with an attorney, and it was this whole thing, right? But there's so many different sides, right? There's so many different sides to the story. And we've been, at least my husband and I have been very adamant that, like, this story is for our children to learn and to write on their own, right? Like, because I want them to see all angles of it. I mean, my parents didn't know anything about my birth mother, so there wasn't really that angle shared. Like, I never really knew anything, right? But we do know things about our children's birth mothers. And so sharing those things and sharing, the love that we experienced, like, was just like, I can't even put it into words. Like, it makes me emotional thinking about it, right? I've shared this story on the podcast before, but walking out of the hospital with my oldest, and I was a train wreck, right? Like, I was a complete train wreck. And I was like, what am I supposed to do with this baby? Like, no one's given me a baby before. Like, right. Like, what do I do with it? Like, it was like, what do I do with my hands? Like, what do I do with this? Right. And I remember her birth mother came up to me and just wrapped her arms around me and said, only happy tears. And she was like the rock in the situation, that was like, she was like, you're going to rock this. Like, this is what needs to happen. And like, just her strength through that whole thing, and her selfless love, was just this whole experience, right? That I want to make sure that my child knows. And so sharing those truths and sharing what we know. And that leads me to another point that I'd written down when you were talking about your scrapbook, or I'm sorry, your baby book. That's something that we did. We need to do it with my 2-year-old. We've done it with my 6-year-old. We created a scrapbook that has what we can put together of her story, right? Like, we've told her before, like, we had to stay in a hotel with you for 7 days because we were in a different state, right? Like, we've told her these different pieces of her story. And so we just decided to take those pictures, like, take the pictures of her in the hotel bath sink, right? Or like, these things that we experienced during that time, during those, especially those first few weeks, and put it there. And I can't even tell you the number of times she gets that out. She gets that out at least weekly. She goes through it. She talks to herself as she goes through it. She asks questions. She points at pictures. She notices something different every time.
Yeah.
And it's so powerful because it's like, on one hand, it's her story to write, but I want to make sure that I give her like all full
Right.
perspective. And I want to make sure that
Yeah,
she knows.
absolutely.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
And I'm always going through my baby book and I'm like, oh wow, look at, here's this letter, and I think there was a time when my parents actually bought me a trip to Africa and we were going to go back. And I wasn't emotionally ready yet. I didn't realize that I wasn't emotionally ready. And I basically created like huge drama, huge fight. I told them I hated them. I did all the things that you did, because I was terrified, because I really wanted to go, and I was angry. I was an angry teenager is what I was.
Mm-hmm,
Now,
mm-hmm.
couple that with just natural teen stuff, but mine was much more amplified because I was lost in it. And it's awesome that, how close I am with my parents now. And I think part of it was just being a teenager, but the other part was I didn't know. I struggled with connection. I really did. I think that's why I'm so good at selling and teaching sales, is because I found a way to connect deeply with people through that vehicle of selling. It's a weird thing, but it's like true for me, and
Yeah.
it's really been a great teacher for me. But I will tell you what's really exciting is I'll be turning 50 next year, and I'm going to Africa. And I feel
Nice.
really it'll be the first time. And I think that there will be this what's coming up for me is this like integration. Like I just feel like it's a soul to soul, like my feet touching the soil of that country will
Mm-hmm.
do. I think I feel like it's just going to, I think it's going to be super transformative. And
Yeah.
now I'm able to go not on this like angry mission, like, why did she, what happened? Why did she do this? Now I come from a place of love, like, wow, I want to experience this culture like a tourist, like I want to know what it's like. I will go back to the orphanage. It's still open. I'll go there. But as far as like trying to find her, maybe I'll go snooping around. Who knows? But I'm
Yeah.
at a much better, took me almost 50 years to get there. But I've actually been in that place for quite a while now, but I'm in a much better state to actually go and explore and pay honor to my country of birth and to the mother who birthed me,
Yeah.
whether I ever see her or not. I don't think I will, but I always send out those telegrams through the umbilical cord. That's like my those old like message shooters. I'm always
Yeah.
shooting messages to her like it's all good. I'm okay.
Sending the
Like,
vibes, huh?
yeah,
Yeah.
life is good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny that you said that when you were talking about that because in my day-to-day, people used to ask me, especially when I was in middle school and high school, they used to ask me like, did tell me like, do what do you want to know about your birth mom? Are you going to find your birth mom? And all these questions that people ask. And I remember thinking like, in my day-to-day, I don't think about it, right? Like tomorrow I'm going to Target, like today I'm doing these interviews, you know what I mean? Like in
Right.
your day-to-day, you're like, no, it's not really something I think about. Like I have my life and,
Yeah.
like close to 50 for me, it's close to 40, right? Like, but every year on my birthday, I think about it. And it's
Mhm.
like my birthday is this like happy but also sad day for me
Mhm.
every year because it's like the only day of the year truly that I sit and think like, gosh, I wonder if she's thinking about me today. And like, I wonder what's coming up for her or if she's even
Yeah.
around, right? Like that's the
Right.
only time that ever
Yeah.
comes up for me. And so it was funny that you said that about the umbilical cord because it's so true. Like sometimes you do just want to be like, hey, like
I'm
it's all
okay.
good. Like you made the
Yeah.
right choice. Like I'm happy, Yeah. Yeah. So
And I
I
think
want to ask.
oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I think you bring up a good point that I think is important for especially parents who are adopting is like present the information, make it available, make yourself open to talk about it, but go at the pace of your child because,
Yeah.
because just be ready. You know what I mean? Like be ready. Don't, I guess my parents never pushed agendas on me, but they created space or they'd because sometimes I'd feel sad if I was listening to like imagine my mom's with her Grammy and her siblings and everyone's talking about like, oh, you're great, 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 great. They're pulling up pictures and there's no connection for me. And she would always just like touch me and be like, this is your family. But I totally like, I get,
Mhm.
I get what's going on. It's just little subtle stuff like that that's really made a big, big difference.
Yeah.
It made me feel a lot more like connected, even when you're not, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And I think too, that what's coming up for me with that is, thinking about we have friends. I was raised, we had some family friends that had like the children that I grew up with, the kids of the family were also adopted. And we had this a couple times, this experience with different families where it's almost like their adoption story, that part of their life, which is obviously a huge part of who they are, was just sort of like brushed over by their adoptive parents. And when I say that, I mean the adoptive parents had, and I see this happen frequently, unfortunately, where adoptive parents are entering adoption as a result of their own infertility journey. And so again, adoption, this is coming from loss. So it's coming
Yeah.
from loss on both sides a lot of
Yeah.
times. And so this happened for this particular family that I'm thinking of. And they were not, I don't think, in an emotionally strong, what's the word I'm looking for? Like emotionally prepared to really handle that piece when it came to their children. And so birth mother just wasn't spoken about. Like it wasn't spoken about, like that whole angle of it. As we talked about the triad, like that wasn't discussed. And so it almost caused more tension and more stress because
I
then
would
you've
say
got
that. I would say
children who are growing up with even more questions and
right.
wondering what's going on and wondering why there's this contempt, right? And
Mhm.
so for me, like now, and I think I shared this before, like having this perspective of, I never really thought about my birth mother before. When my children were adopted, it shifted my perspective entirely because I had that experience and I had to build that relationship
Yeah.
with their birth mothers. And so it
Yeah.
gave me more perspective on my own.
Yeah.
But if you're listening to this and you have an adopted child or you're thinking about it, just know, first of all, that adoption comes from loss, sometimes from both angles.
Yeah.
And also that you could be doing the child a disservice
Right.
by
It is a great
brushing that
disservice.
under the rug, right? Like it is seriously like part of who they are. And
Yeah.
so as hard as it can be sometimes, because I think, I think about this particular woman that I'm thinking of and how it was very much like, well, I'm her mother, right? Like,
Right.
well,
That's
I'm,
why they don't do it though, because there is this insecurity slash anxiety slash fear that because this happened in the community. There was
mhm,
adoptive parents that would say, like, we haven't told our kid, blah, 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 but we're afraid this is our child. And it's like, you telling the truth doesn't make them any less your child. It actually solidifies your relationship as mother as parent and child. Because if you think about it on the very most basic level, let's forget about adoption. Let's just talk parent children.
mhm,
They are the voice. We trust them implicitly. And that is our first relationship of trust,
yeah,
right? And if trust is broken, it is very hard. It's taken my friend that I mentioned earlier who found out that she was adopted. Now it was her birth mother, but her father was not her biological father. It has now taken them 15 years to heal that relationship,
yeah,
you know, and that took more work on both parts. But you don't want that because
mhm,
trust is an inherent birthright for us, for parent to child, and the children need that.
mhm,
They're looking to you. They're vulnerable and they need that. So I would say if you really, if and this is me kind of, I kind of have a sassy mouth, so I'm not trying to be super sassy or offensive, but I would say if your heart is for being that child's parent, and I know that that's true. I know that no one's like making that decision out of malice. It's out of
mhm,
fear.
yeah,
Be the parent. And that means you have to do what's uncomfortable and know that will pay them back
absolutely.
infinity.
Tenfold. Yeah. Yeah.
Now I'm speaking as the adult because a lot of people forget that these little cute little babies and little children, they grow up to be
To be
adults.
adults. Yep.
And you want that.
Yep.
And as a parent, you want that relationship with your child as an adult.
Yeah. Well, and this is something that you alluded to it earlier, this deep sense of trust that you have with your parents, right? And where that came from,
Yeah.
and you know, I always say to people like, well, when people would ask me questions about like, well, what about your I hated it when they would say, what about your real mom? Like,
I
please don't
know.
use that language, right? Like,
Yes,
let's not use
please
that language.
don't.
And so I used to always respond and say like, well, this is my real mom, right? Like pointing to my adoptive mom. And so um, I want to touch on that because I think that's important for us to make sure we cover this month on the podcast is just this idea of adoption friendly language, like
Yes.
things that people say, and of course you and I both have this interesting take on this because we both were the child that is now the
Yes.
adult. What would you say on the topic of adoption friendly language? What drove you crazy, I guess?
Real mom, where's your real mom? Also being asked what I was a lot, like, what are you?
Mm-hmm.
From an ethnicity standpoint, bothered me immensely because I was like, I don't know.
Yeah.
And then I'd get flipped and be like, a human being. But but yeah, like, or they saved you. Like, and I think that it's almost like if you see someone and you're not sure if they're pregnant, you don't say, hey, how far along are you? It's
Right.
that same thing. Like, I don't think that unless, we're volunteering the story, like you shouldn't be asking where your real mom is. You say, oh, what, like, where's your, do you know anything about your birth parents?
Right.
Birth parents is because that's who birth does,
Right.
and I think that's more appropriate.
Yeah. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
That bothered the crap out of me. I haven't heard that in so long. What's interesting is my mom and I now, and I don't know if it's because, there's something, maybe because we've been around each other. You know how women, if they hang out together, they start getting on the same rhythm with their menstrual cycle.
Uh-huh.
I've got, now we get compliments like, you guys look so much alike. And it's like, really? That's like,
That's what I was going to say. I used to get that all the time. I used to get people in school that would say, you look just like your dad. And I figured they said that because I looked absolutely nothing like my mom. Like my mom she still is like black hair, black, dark eyes, like features. And my dad was bald and Caucasian. And so people would just be like, oh my gosh, you look like your dad. And I'd be like, that's interesting. But this is a funny story. We have, like I said, my husband is Caucasian as well. He is 6'4", and both of my girls are biracial. And when my oldest was probably 3 or 4, we moved into this neighborhood, and Chris and my oldest would go outside and play basketball, or they'd ride the bike down the street or whatever. And we had this one particular neighbor every time who would be like, every time she'd be like, you look so much like your dad, you're tall like your dad. And she would make these comments. And sometimes I was even there and I'm thinking, wow, like, this is interesting. Like people really just don't think it through. Right. And sometimes it's that, and sometimes it's just a lack of awareness and a lack of knowledge. I know that one phrase that was told to us and this was hard for me because this was a phrase that I grew up with, was the same woman that I was telling you about, the social worker. She told us that you should never use the phrase giving up. Like you weren't given up for adoption.
Yeah, it's placed.
And so it was, you were placed, right? And so that was something that we really had to work through because I was always told like, well, you were given up for adoption. Like that was part of the story that I was told. And it wasn't necessarily that I had a negative connotation to it until we started that process for ourselves. And someone said, hey, let's use different terminology. And so just understanding that even little things like that can make a huge difference, especially when you're talking to your children and as your children get older. But yeah, my oldest this summer at the pool, there was a little boy there and he was asking her, and he was like, where are you from? And it was so obvious that he was asking her because her skin color was different. Yeah. And so she so proudly looked at him and said, the US of A. And I was like, it's hilarious. But I've said this before on the podcast, but to me, like going into adopting both of our girls, knowing the race thing was going to most likely be happening, we knew, like, I told my husband, I was like, here's the thing, I can do all the education on transracial adoption. I can be open to entering the room where I am the minority. I can do all these things. But for me, like making sure that she is confident as a person so that she can handle these questions that come her way, so that she's emotionally intelligent to understand that some people just don't get it, or some people aren't using the right. You're right. If I can help her to be that person, emotionally intelligent, strong, and confident, then everything else will fall into place.
I think so too. 1,000%, because I think that's basically kind of the route that my family went, right? It's like, let's teach you how to be competent, to be caring, to be aware, to be all of us are very socially involved in justice and things of that nature. And if we weren't, that probably would be the biggest. My parents would be upset if we weren't like interested in like causes that we should care about and things of that nature. But yes, I think that at the end of the day, everyone's just doing the best that they can. And I think just like what we're learning with everything that's happening in our world right now, tabling adoption for a moment, we're learning what's acceptable, what's sensitive, what's not. And
Mm-hmm.
if you just give yourself grace. You know what I mean? I always say, like, give yourself grace. We're not always going to get it right the first time. But if
Mm-hmm.
me changing wording from like master bedroom to primary is all that it takes for you to feel more comfortable, I'll do it, and it's the
Yeah,
same thing with adoption. Now I've heard birth mothers say, I gave up my child for adoption, and that's for them to say because that's their own
absolutely.
experience. But for a child to hear that they were given up, no
Yeah.
child wants to hear that, right? So you're right.
Mm-hmm.
Having that, just being super set. I'm sure there's books out there too, as far as like just language appropriate, like how to be appropriate and sensitive with language. And even like with your daughter, because people used to ask me that all the time, like, where are you from? And I would get, or who are you? And I would have these flippant responses. There was times that my mom would pull me to the side and say, hey, I noticed how you answered that question. How do you feel about the question that was asked to you?
Mm-hmm.
So that I had a place to actually talk through, like, that pissed me off, and this is why it pissed me off, and it made me uncomfortable, and here's why, like, just creating space for dialogue, because you're right, you're dealing with your child who's um coming in with some disadvantages, but there's a lot of it, like, I don't know, it's such a hard thing, because the thing that I want to make sure that you hear out of my mouth is that yes, there's loss, yes, there's emotional challenges, that there's attachment disorder, there's all these things that come with it in certain circumstances, and then
Mm-hmm.
there's some that's like not even a thing, right? So I just think
Yeah.
everyone has their own journey, and still with anything in life, whether it's tragedy, loss, pain, I'm still all for the love. And I think that, culturally, there's an opportunity for us as a people. If you look at other cultures, like villages to raise children,
Mhm.
and to me, every child has a right to be raised by their village, by a village, whether it be your mom, your dad, your siblings.
Yeah.
That's the village, your friends. And I was raised by a village with my parents and my aunts and my Grammy and my uncles and, my cousins.
Yeah.
And I just think that there's nothing greater than that. And so, in spite of all those things that I say that happen, I'm still super happy. And I love,
Yeah.
I would recommend adoption to anyone who's responsibly ready to adopt.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've loved everything that you've had to say. I've taken a lot of notes just for myself because I like the way that I love your perspective on truth and this concept of deep trust and building that um, as adoptive parents. I want to wrap up with just one final question. We've talked a lot about a lot of different things tonight. We talked about language. We've talked about, you know, um, parent relationships. We've talked about what it can look like to be part of a transracial family. Like there's so many things that we've discussed, but at the end of the day, like what would you say if you were speaking to a couple who's thinking of adopting or a young family that has an adopted child? What would be your number one piece of advice?
I feel like the advice that I would give someone is be willing to, especially if it's a racial adoption, is be willing to immerse yourself in that culture and make sure that your child understands that they
Mhm.
equally understand that. Um, it should be not just like a trip to a museum. It should be do your best. And if you're not comfortable doing that, then you might want to consider something else. But I also think that I would also say, like, being a parent, I imagine, because I'm not one, but being a parent is scary and you're going to mess up. And like, I think if you go in with an intention of you want to provide a family to a child that may not have one otherwise, you don't want them stuck in the system or
Mhm.
stuck in an orphanage, and you want to provide that. Just trust yourself that you will find the right tools to support you on the journey. You don't have to have them all
Yeah.
at the beginning. Look at you will never stop acquiring tools and
Mhm.
resources and ways to be the best parent that you can be. um, and dealing with an adopted child is no different than dealing with a child, except that it comes with its own, like, um, what's the right word, it's almost like unique parts.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah,
You know,
you're so right.
it gets its own unique assembly versus
Mhm.
a regular toy, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think, I remember thinking that I just in my stories recently, because I look at my Facebook memories every so often, and um, I just saw a memory pop up the other day that was like, I wish I could remember what it said exactly, but it was a meme that said it was from maybe 2 days after Ellery was born.
Mm.
And it said, like, I'm just going to put on some rap and figure out how to handle this. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, and no one does. Right. And so there's
Oh
no
my
such thing
God.
as there's no such thing as a perfect parent. I
Yeah.
can assure you that had I grown up in my birth mother's family, she would not
You'd
have been
have
a perfect
issues
parent.
too. Yeah.
And my adoptive parents were also not perfect parents, but
Yeah.
all that matters at the end of the day is, as you said, both truth and love.
Yeah. There's
Thank
deep
you.
love and respect. And I think that's all there is to it. Yeah.
Yeah. Amen. Okay, my friend. Well, we have exceeded our time here on the podcast, but I'm so grateful that you've taken time out of your day to share your story and your perspective. I know there's going to be somebody listening to this who has newfound appreciation for your story and for what maybe they might pursue themselves. So thank you so much for taking time. For everyone listening, I will link up in the show notes for you any resources that I think could be handy as it pertains to this topic that we discussed tonight. And also, I will link up any way that you might be able to reach Aandra if you have any questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.